The autumn sun cast long shadows across Fort Marshall as Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez approached the main gate for what she assumed would be another routine morning. The crisp October air carried the familiar sounds of military life, distant marching cadences, the rumble of vehicles, and the sharp commands echoing from various training grounds. Elena had been walking this same path for 3 years, but today felt different somehow. Elena wasn't particularly tall, standing at 5 feet 6 inches, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of proven leadership. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform was pressed to perfection. What most people noticed first about Elena weren't her physical features, but the way she observed everything around her with sharp, calculating eyes. She had learned early in her military career that awareness was survival, and survival was everything. As the newly appointed base operations commander, Elena had spent the previous week in endless briefings, reviewing personnel files, and familiarizing herself with the complex web of daily operations that kept Fort Marshall running smoothly. The base housed over 8,000 active duty personnel, making it one of the largest training facilities on the East Coast. Her promotion had come through just 2 weeks ago, and she was still getting used to the weight of responsibility that came with overseeing such a massive operation. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was approaching the very gate where she had first entered Fort Marshall as a nervous 20-year-old recruit. Back then, she had been intimidated by everything: the stern-faced guards, the imposing concrete barriers, the sense that she was entering a world where every mistake could have consequences. Now, she was responsible for ensuring that world ran smoothly. Elena had chosen to walk to work today instead of driving, partly because she enjoyed the morning exercise, but mainly because she wanted to observe the base from ground level. As a commander, it was easy to become isolated in meetings and paperwork, losing touch with the daily realities that her soldiers faced. She made it a point to stay connected to the enlisted experience, remembering her own journey from private to her current position. The main gate came into view as she rounded the corner of the administrative building. Even from a distance, she could see that something was off. There was a crowd gathering, voices were raised, and the usually orderly flow of morning traffic had come to a complete stop. Elena's pace quickened instinctively. In her experience, crowds at military installations usually meant trouble. As she drew closer, the situation became clearer. 3 young men in civilian clothes were standing near the visitor checkpoint, their voices loud and aggressive. They appeared to be in their early 20s, with the kind of swagger that Elena recognized immediately. Fresh recruits, probably reporting for basic training, trying to prove something to themselves or each other. The tallest of the 3, a lean young man with bleached blonde hair and an expensive-looking jacket, was pointing aggressively at one of the gate guards. His voice carried clearly across the morning air, filled with indignation and entitlement. "Do you know who my father is?" he was shouting. "This is completely unacceptable treatment. We demand to speak to whoever is in charge here immediately." Elena slowed her approach, choosing to observe before intervening. She had learned that understanding the full context of a situation was crucial before taking action. Too many commanders made the mistake of rushing in with authority blazing, only to discover later that they had misread the circumstances entirely. The gate guard, a young corporal named Martinez whom Elena recognized from her recent personnel reviews, was maintaining his composure admirably despite the verbal assault. He stood at attention, his expression neutral, following protocol exactly as he had been trained. Elena made a mental note to commend his professionalism later. "Sir, I understand your frustration," Corporal Martinez was saying in a calm, steady voice. "However, all visitors to the base must follow proper identification and screening procedures. These protocols are in place for the security of everyone on the installation." The second recruit, shorter and stockier with dark hair and an attitude that seemed to compensate for his size, stepped forward aggressively. "Security protocols? We're here to serve our country, not get hassled by some nobody gate guard. This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that's wrong with the military." Elena felt her jaw tighten slightly. She had heard similar complaints countless times over her career, usually from individuals who had never actually served but felt entitled to express opinions about military operations. What bothered her most was the disrespect being shown to Corporal Martinez, who was simply doing his job according to regulations that existed for very good reasons. The third recruit had remained quieter than his companions, but Elena could see him recording the interaction on his phone. This was becoming more common, and, while she understood the impulse to document potential misconduct, she suspected this recording was being made for very different reasons. The body language and positioning suggested this was intended to be shared on social media, probably with a narrative about military incompetence or abuse of power. "Look," the tall blonde recruit continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive, "I don't think you understand the situation here. My father is Congressman Bradley Harrison. You might have heard of him? He sits on the House Armed Services Committee. One phone call from me, and your entire career could be over." Elena had indeed heard of Congressman Harrison. He was known for his grandstanding and his tendency to use his position for personal benefit rather than genuine public service. She had dealt with entitled family members of politicians before, and they were usually more trouble than they were worth. However, she also knew that handling them incorrectly could create political complications that extended far beyond a simple gate incident. Corporal Martinez's expression didn't change, but Elena could see the slight tension in his shoulders. He was clearly aware of the political implications of the situation, which put him in an impossible position. If he enforced the regulations, he risked political retaliation. If he bent the rules, he would be violating his oath and potentially compromising base security. "Sir," Martinez replied carefully, "regardless of anyone's background or connections, all personnel entering Fort Marshall must complete the required security screening. This applies to everyone from the highest-ranking generals to civilian contractors. I'm not authorized to make exceptions to these protocols." The stocky recruit laughed mockingly. "Not authorized? That's rich. You're probably barely authorized to tie your own boots. We need to talk to someone with actual authority around here, not some low-ranking nobody who peaked in high school." Elena felt her professional composure being tested. The insult to Martinez was completely unwarranted and unprofessional. More importantly, these recruits were demonstrating exactly the kind of attitude that would make them problems throughout their military service if it wasn't addressed immediately and decisively. She was close enough now to intervene, but she wanted to see how the situation developed for a few more moments. Leadership often required patience and observation rather than immediate action. Sometimes the best way to handle a problem was to let it fully reveal itself before applying a solution. The crowd that had gathered was growing larger. Other soldiers passing through the gate had stopped to watch, some looking amused, others appearing concerned. Elena noticed several senior enlisted personnel in the group, including a master sergeant she recognized from her briefings. The expressions on their faces suggested they were as unimpressed with the recruit's behavior as she was. What troubled Elena most was the precedent this incident could set. If word got out that recruits could bully their way through security by dropping political names and making threats, it would undermine the authority of every guard and the integrity of the entire security system. Military discipline depended on consistent enforcement of standards, regardless of who was being held to those standards. The blonde recruit pulled out his phone and began dialing. "Fine," he announced loudly, clearly performing for the growing audience. "I'm calling my father right now. We'll see how quickly your tune changes when a congressman gets involved." Elena decided it was time to step forward. She had seen enough to understand the full situation, and allowing it to escalate further would serve no one's interests. However, she was also aware that how she handled this moment would be closely observed by everyone present, and would likely be discussed throughout the base for weeks to come. As she approached the group, Elena noticed that none of the three recruits paid her any attention. She was in utilities rather than dress uniform, and, without any visible rank insignia from their angle, they apparently assumed she was just another curious onlooker. This would work to her advantage. "Excuse me," she said in a calm, professional voice as she stepped into the circle. "I couldn't help but notice there seems to be some kind of problem here." The tall recruit looked at her dismissively. "Yeah, there's a problem. This gate guard is power tripping and refusing to let us through even though we're supposed to report for training. He apparently doesn't understand that we're not just regular recruits." Elena nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this perspective seriously. "I see. And What makes you different from regular recruits? The stocky recruit jumped in eagerly. Well, for starters, Brandon here is Congressman Harrison's son. I'm sure you've heard of him. And, my family owns Harrison Industries, which has several defense contracts. We're not the kind of people who should be getting hassled at the gate. Interesting, Elena replied, her tone remaining neutral. And, you believe that family connections should grant you special privileges in military service? Not special privileges, the third recruit spoke up for the first time, still holding his phone ready to record. Just basic respect and recognition of who we are. This guard is treating us like common criminals instead of future officers. Elena raised an eyebrow slightly. Future officers? Are you enrolled in an officer commissioning program? The three recruits exchanged glances, and Elena caught the brief moment of uncertainty that passed between them. Clearly, they had assumed that their backgrounds would automatically qualify them for officer status, regardless of their actual qualifications or commitment. We haven't worked out all the details yet, the blonde recruit said, his confidence wavering slightly. But, with our backgrounds and connections, I'm sure arrangements can be made. Elena nodded again, maintaining her thoughtful expression. Around them, she could see that the crowd was listening intently. Several of the senior enlisted personnel had moved closer, clearly interested in how this conversation would develop. Well, Elena said finally, I think I might be able to help resolve this situation. Would you mind if I took a look at your identification and enlistment paperwork? The three recruits brightened immediately, apparently believing they had found someone sympathetic to their position. They quickly produced their IDs and the various documents they had been given during their recruitment process. Elena examined the papers carefully, taking her time to review every detail. She wanted to ensure she had all the facts before proceeding, but she also wanted to build some suspense among the watching crowd. Sometimes the most effective leadership moments were also the most dramatic ones. Everything appears to be in order, she announced after several minutes. You are indeed scheduled to begin basic training today. However, I noticed something interesting in your paperwork. The recruits leaned forward eagerly, expecting to hear something that would vindicate their position. According to these documents, you enlisted as E1 privates, just like every other new recruit. There's no mention of any special status, accelerated promotion programs, or exemptions from standard military procedures. The confident expressions on the recruits' faces began to fade slightly. Elena continued in the same calm, professional tone. In fact, by enlisting in the United States Army, you have voluntarily agreed to follow all military regulations and submit to the authority of the military command structure. This includes security protocols at installation gates. She handed the documents back to the increasingly uncomfortable recruits. Now, I believe Corporal Martinez was attempting to explain these protocols to you, and you responded with threats and demands for special treatment. Is that an accurate summary of the situation? The stocky recruit's face was beginning to redden. Look, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you clearly don't understand how things work around here. We're not just anybody, and we deserve to be treated with respect. Elena's expression remained perfectly calm, but those who knew her well would have recognized the dangerous stillness that had settled over her features. It was the same expression she wore when dealing with serious discipline problems or security threats. You're absolutely right about one thing, she said quietly. You do deserve to be treated with respect. Every soldier does. Just as Corporal Martinez deserves to be treated with respect while he performs his duties. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. The question is whether you understand that respect in the military is earned through service and sacrifice, not inherited through family connections or purchased with wealth. The crowd around them had grown completely silent. Even the normal background noise of the base seemed to fade as everyone focused on the developing confrontation. The tall blonde recruit, apparently realizing that this woman was not going to be the ally they had hoped for, decided to reassert his authority. I think this conversation is over. I want to speak to the base commander immediately. I'm sure he'll be very interested to know how his personnel are treating the son of a sitting congressman. Elena smiled for the first time since approaching the group. It was not a warm smile. Well, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard, I think that can be arranged. Elena reached into her utility pocket and withdrew her military identification card. The movement was deliberate and unhurried, designed to build tension among the watching crowd. She held the card at eye level, ensuring that everyone present could see it clearly. Allow me to introduce myself properly, she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command authority. Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, Base Operations Commander, Fort Marshall. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from the faces of all three recruits simultaneously. The blonde recruit's mouth fell open slightly, while his stocky companion took an involuntary step backward. The third recruit's phone, which had been recording everything, suddenly seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in his trembling hands. The crowd of onlookers, which had been silent before, now became absolutely motionless. Elena could sense the mixture of anticipation and satisfaction radiating from the assembled soldiers. They had witnessed arrogant recruits get their comeuppance, and everyone present understood that they were about to see a masterclass in military leadership. Elena allowed the silence to stretch for several long moments, letting the full weight of the situation settle over the three young men. She had learned over her years of service that sometimes the most powerful leadership tool was simply allowing people to fully comprehend the consequences of their actions. Now then, she continued in the same calm, measured tone, let's review what just transpired here, shall we? 3 future soldiers arrived at the gate of a military installation and, when asked to follow standard security procedures, responded with threats, insults, and demands for special treatment based on family connections. She began pacing slowly in front of the group, her hands clasped behind her back in a classic military posture. Every eye in the courtyard followed her movement. You threatened Corporal Martinez's career because he was doing his job correctly. You suggested that military regulations shouldn't apply to you because of your family backgrounds. You recorded this interaction, presumably to share on social media as evidence of military incompetence. Elena stopped pacing and faced the 3 recruits directly. Most importantly, you demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service actually means. You seem to believe that wearing the uniform makes you special. Let me clarify something for you, the uniform doesn't make you special. Living up to the standards represented by that uniform is what makes you special. The tall blonde recruit, who had been so confident just minutes before, now looked as if he wanted nothing more than for the ground to open up and swallow him. His voice, when he finally managed to speak, was barely above a whisper. Ma'am, we didn't realize, we thought. Elena held up a hand, cutting him off. What you thought was that your family connections would allow you to skip the parts of military service that you found inconvenient or beneath your status. What you thought was that being a congressman's son meant you could bully junior enlisted personnel without consequences. She gestured toward Corporal Martinez, who had maintained his professional composure throughout the entire incident. This soldier has been performing his duties exactly as trained, showing respect for the regulations that keep this base secure, and maintaining his military bearing despite being verbally attacked. In other words, he has been demonstrating the professionalism that you will need to learn if you hope to succeed in the Army. The stocky recruit finally found his voice, though it shook noticeably. Ma'am, we're sorry. We didn't mean any disrespect. We were just frustrated and... Frustrated, Elena repeated, her tone remaining level but somehow becoming more intimidating. Let me share something with you about frustration in military service. You will be frustrated when you're doing physical training at 5 in the morning in freezing rain. You will be frustrated when you're cleaning equipment for the 3rd time because it wasn't done perfectly the first 2 times. You will be frustrated when you're standing guard duty at 2 in the morning while your civilian friends are out having fun. She paused, letting this sink in before continuing. The question is not whether you will face frustration. The question is whether you will respond to that frustration with professionalism and discipline, or whether you will throw tantrums and demand special treatment. Elena turned to address the crowd that had gathered. Many of the observers were junior enlisted personnel who had arrived for their morning duties and been caught up in the drama. She recognized this as a teaching moment that extended far beyond the 3 recruits. Everyone here needs to understand something fundamental about military service, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. Rank and authority in the military are not inherited. They are not purchased. They are not granted because of family connections or personal wealth. They are earned through demonstrated competence, leadership, and commitment to the mission. She gestured toward her own uniform. I started my military career as an E1 private, just like these three young men will. I earned every promotion through hard work, dedication, and proving that I could be trusted with increasing levels of responsibility. That's how the system works, and it's why it works. Elena returned her attention to the three recruits, who were now looking thoroughly chastened. The arrogance and entitlement that had characterized their behavior just minutes before had evaporated completely, replaced by obvious anxiety about what would happen next. Now, she continued, we need to address the immediate situation. You have several choices ahead of you, and the decisions you make in the next few minutes will likely determine whether your military careers begin with success or failure. The blonde recruit, Brandon Harrison, cleared his throat nervously. What are our options, ma'am? Elena appreciated that he had at least remembered to use the proper form of address, though she suspected fear rather than respect was motivating his sudden politeness. Your first option is to continue with your current attitude and approach to military service. You can insist that you deserve special treatment, continue making threats about family connections, and generally maintain the belief that military standards don't apply to you. If you choose this path, I can virtually guarantee that your military experience will be brief and unpleasant. She paused to let this option sink in before continuing. Your second option is to recognize that you made serious errors in judgment here today, learn from those errors, and commit to approaching your military service with the humility and professionalism that it requires. The third recruit, who had been recording the interaction, finally spoke up. Ma'am, what about the recording? I was planning to post this online, but now. Elena nodded approvingly. I'm glad you brought that up. What you do with that recording will be another indication of your character and your readiness for military service. You could certainly post it online with some narrative about military power abuse or unfair treatment. I'm sure you could get plenty of social media attention and sympathy from people who don't understand military culture. She stepped closer to the young man, her expression serious but not unkind. However, I would encourage you to consider what that recording actually shows. It shows three privileged young men attempting to bully a professional soldier who was doing his job correctly. It shows future military personnel demonstrating exactly the kind of entitled attitude that undermines unit cohesion and military effectiveness. Elena gestured toward the crowd of watching soldiers. Everyone here has now seen you learn an important lesson about military service. They've seen you realize that your civilian status and family connections mean nothing in this environment. They've seen you begin to understand what military discipline actually requires. The question is whether you want that lesson to be the beginning of your military education or the end of it. The stocky recruit looked around nervously at the assembled soldiers, many of whom were watching with obvious amusement. Ma'am, what do you think we should do? Elena smiled slightly, the first genuinely warm expression she had shown since approaching the group. I think you should demonstrate that you're capable of learning from your mistakes. I think you should show respect for the soldier you insulted and apologize for your unprofessional behavior. Most importantly, I think you should recognize this moment as an opportunity to start your military service on the right foot. Brandon Harrison stepped forward, his posture now much more humble than it had been earlier. Ma'am, we owe Corporal Martinez an apology. We were completely out of line, and there's no excuse for how we behaved. Elena nodded approvingly but remained silent, allowing the young man to continue. Corporal Martinez, Brandon continued, turning to face the gate guard who had remained professionally silent throughout the entire confrontation, I apologize for my behavior. You were doing your job correctly, and I had no right to threaten you or treat you disrespectfully. I hope you can forgive my ignorance and give me a chance to prove that I can do better. Corporal Martinez, who had maintained perfect military bearing throughout the ordeal, nodded formally. Apology accepted, sir. We all have learning experiences. The other two recruits quickly followed with their own apologies, each acknowledging their inappropriate behavior and expressing commitment to approaching their military service with better attitudes. Elena observed these apologies carefully. She had seen enough insincere apologies over her career to recognize the difference between genuine remorse and simple fear of consequences. While she suspected these young men were primarily motivated by their current predicament, she also sensed that the shock of the situation had created a genuine learning opportunity. "Very good," she said once all three had finished apologizing. "Now, let's discuss how we move forward from here. You still need to complete the security screening process that Corporal Martinez was attempting to conduct when this situation began. You will do so politely, efficiently, and without complaint." She gestured toward the security checkpoint. "Once you've been properly cleared onto the base, you will report to the reception battalion as scheduled. Your drill sergeants will be informed that you arrived on time and completed all required procedures correctly." Elena paused, making sure she had their full attention. "However, they will not be informed about this incident unless it becomes relevant to your performance during basic training. In other words, you have an opportunity to start fresh, with your reputations intact." The relief on the three young faces was obvious and immediate. They had clearly expected much worse consequences for their behavior. "But, understand this," Elena continued, her tone becoming more serious again, "this is your one free lesson in military professionalism. There will not be another. If you demonstrate this kind of entitled, disrespectful attitude again during your service, there will be consequences that your family connections cannot shield you from." She looked directly at Brandon Harrison. "Your father's position on the Armed Services Committee will not protect you from being discharged if you prove unfit for military service. In fact, having a father in Congress will likely make the military more strict about ensuring you meet every standard, not less." Brandon nodded earnestly. "Yes, ma'am. I understand completely." Elena turned to address the crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation. "I want everyone here to take something away from this situation. Military service is about more than following orders and wearing uniforms. It's about developing character, learning humility, and understanding that true leadership comes from serving others rather than serving yourself." She gestured toward the three recruits, who were now standing at a much more respectful attention. "These young men made mistakes today, but they've shown they're capable of learning from those mistakes. That's more than many people can say. Everyone deserves the chance to grow and improve, especially when they're willing to put on the uniform and serve their country." The crowd began to disperse, with soldiers returning to their morning duties. However, Elena noticed that many of them paused to nod respectfully to Corporal Martinez as they passed, a clear indication that his professional handling of a difficult situation had been noted and appreciated. Elena remained with the three recruits as they completed their security screening. She wanted to ensure that the process went smoothly and that there were no lingering tensions from the earlier confrontation. She also wanted to observe how they handled the routine procedures now that they understood their place in the military hierarchy. To their credit, all three young men were polite, cooperative, and patient during the screening process. They followed instructions promptly, answered questions respectfully, and showed none of the arrogance that had characterized their earlier behavior. As they finished the final steps of the security process, Brandon Harrison approached Elena one more time. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "thank you for giving us a second chance. I know we didn't deserve it, but I promise you won't regret it." Elena studied the young man's expression carefully. She had learned to read people well over her years of service, and she sensed genuine sincerity in his words. "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "Prove that you meant what you said today. Show your drill sergeants and your fellow soldiers that you understand what military service really means. If you do that, then we can talk about whether second chances were deserved." As the three recruits headed off toward the reception battalion to begin their military training, Elena remained at the gate for a few more minutes, reviewing the morning's events with Corporal Martinez. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at the gate, and Elena Rodriguez had largely put the confrontation with the three entitled recruits out of her mind. As base operations commander, she dealt with hundreds of personnel issues, logistical challenges, and administrative responsibilities every day. The gate incident had been resolved satisfactorily, the recruits had begun their basic training without further incident, and she had moved on to other priorities. However, Elena made it a practice to follow up on significant disciplinary situations, particularly those involving new recruits. She believed that leadership required continuity and consistency. It wasn't enough to address problems when they occurred, effective commanders needed to ensure that solutions actually worked and that lessons were learned permanently rather than temporarily. That's why she found herself walking toward the basic training area on a crisp morning in early November, ostensibly to conduct a routine inspection of training facilities, but actually to observe how Brandon Harrison and his companions were adapting to military life. She was curious to see whether their apparent transformation at the gate had been genuine or simply a temporary response to being caught and embarrassed. The basic training compound at Fort Marshall was a world unto itself, deliberately isolated from the rest of the base to create an immersive environment where civilian recruits could be transformed into soldiers. The barracks, training facilities, and administrative buildings were functional rather than comfortable, designed to reinforce the message that military service was about mission accomplishment rather than personal comfort. Elena arrived at the compound during the morning physical training session, one of the most revealing times to observe recruit behavior. PT was where individual character often showed itself most clearly, where the gap between those who were genuinely committed to transformation and those who were simply enduring the experience became obvious. She positioned herself at a distance where she could observe without interfering with the training process. Drill Sergeant Williams, a 20-year veteran whom Elena knew and respected, was putting a platoon through a series of exercises designed to build both physical fitness and mental toughness. The recruits were performing push-ups, and Elena could see the strain and exhaustion on many faces as they struggled to meet the demanding standards. It took her a moment to identify Brandon Harrison among the sweating, uniformed figures, but when she did, she was surprised by what she saw. The young man who had strutted arrogantly at the gate 2 weeks earlier was now indistinguishable from his fellow recruits. His expensive haircut had been replaced by a regulation buzz cut, his designer clothes traded for standard issue fatigues, and his entitled attitude apparently replaced by focused determination. More importantly, Elena observed that when one of his fellow recruits began to struggle with the exercise, Brandon moved closer and began offering quiet encouragement. This was significant because it indicated that he was developing the kind of team-focused mindset that was essential for military success. Soldiers who only cared about their own performance rarely became effective leaders. Elena continued watching as the platoon moved through various exercises. She noticed that all 3 of the recruits from the gate incident were present and appeared to be performing at the same level as their peers. There were no signs of special treatment, no indication that they were receiving preferential consideration, and no evidence of the entitled behavior that had characterized their initial arrival. After the PT session concluded, Elena approached Drill Sergeant Williams, who was reviewing performance notes with his assistant. Williams was a compact, muscular man with the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. He had been transforming civilians into soldiers for over a decade, and Elena valued his assessment of recruit potential. "Good morning, Drill Sergeant," Elena said as she approached. "Mind if I ask you about a few of your recruits?" Williams looked up from his notes and immediately came to attention. "Good morning, ma'am." "Of course, how can I help you?" Elena gestured toward the group of recruits who were now moving toward the mess hall for breakfast. "I'm curious about your assessment of Harrison, Chen, and Morrison. They arrived about 2 weeks ago." Williams considered the question thoughtfully. In Elena's experience, good drill sergeants were excellent judges of character because their job required them to quickly identify each recruit's strengths, weaknesses, and potential for development. "Interesting group, ma'am," Williams replied. "Harrison especially caught my attention during the first few days. He had some attitude adjustment needs initially, but once he figured out how things work here, he's been one of my more motivated recruits." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Attitude adjustment needs?" "Nothing too serious, ma'am." Classic rich kid syndrome, thought he knew better than everyone else, questioned why certain procedures were necessary, made comments about his family connections. Standard stuff for recruits from privileged backgrounds. Williams paused, apparently recalling specific incidents. "But Here's the thing that impressed me about Harrison: when I called him out on his attitude, he didn't argue or make excuses. He listened, acknowledged the problem, and made immediate changes. That's actually pretty rare. Most recruits with his background either wash out or spend weeks fighting the system before they accept it. This was encouraging news. Elena had seen many recruits who appeared to learn lessons during dramatic confrontations but, then, reverted to their original behavior once the immediate pressure was removed. The fact that Brandon was consistently demonstrating better behavior suggested that his transformation might be genuine. What about his performance? Elena asked. Solid middle of the pack physically, which is actually better than I expected based on his initial presentation. But, where he's really excelling is in leadership potential. He's naturally good at motivating other recruits, he's developed strong situational awareness, and he's shown real courage when it comes to standing up for soldiers who are struggling. Williams consulted his notes briefly. Just yesterday, he intervened when a couple of recruits were picking on Morrison, the smaller guy who came in with him. Harrison could have stayed out of it, but he stepped up and made it clear that kind of behavior wasn't acceptable. That showed me he's developing the right kind of military values. Elena was genuinely surprised by this information. The young man who had threatened Corporal Martinez's career was now defending fellow soldiers from bullying. This suggested a level of personal growth that went beyond simply learning to follow rules. And the other two, she asked. Chen has been consistently solid from day one. No drama, no problems, just steady improvement across all areas. Morrison started rough, clearly intimidated by everything, but he's showing real determination. The three of them have actually become a pretty effective team, which is interesting given how they started. Elena thanked Drill Sergeant Williams and continued her tour of the training facilities, but her mind kept returning to what she had learned about the three recruits. Personal transformation was one of the most rewarding aspects of military service, both for the individuals who experienced it and for the leaders who had the opportunity to witness it. Later that morning, Elena was reviewing administrative reports in her office when her secretary informed her that she had a phone call from Congressman Bradley Harrison. Elena's first thought was that Brandon must have gotten into serious trouble and his father was calling to complain or demand special treatment. However, she accepted the call with professional courtesy. "Congressman Harrison," she said as she picked up the phone. "How can I help you today?" "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," came the congressman's voice, sounding much less aggressive than Elena had expected. "I wanted to thank you for how you handled the situation with my son a couple of weeks ago." Elena was taken aback. This was definitely not the conversation she had anticipated. "Sir?" "Brandon called me after his first week of basic training," Harrison continued. "He told me about what happened at the gate, and he told me how you handled it. I have to admit, I was initially angry that he had been embarrassed publicly, but after thinking about it more, I realize you did exactly what needed to be done." Elena remained silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. "The truth is, Staff Sergeant, my son has been spoiled and entitled his entire life. My wife and I gave him everything he wanted, protected him from consequences, and basically created a young man who thought the world owed him special treatment because of who his family was." Harrison paused, and Elena could hear genuine emotion in his voice when he continued. "But when he called me after that first week, he was different. He was humbler, more respectful, and he seemed to actually understand what military service means. He told me he had learned more about character and leadership in 1 week of basic training than in his entire previous life." Elena was beginning to understand why the congressman was calling. "Sir, your son deserves the credit for his improvement. He chose to learn from a difficult situation instead of fighting it." "Maybe so, but you gave him the opportunity to make that choice. You could have simply punished him for his behavior, or you could have ignored it entirely. Instead, you turned it into a teaching moment that seems to have genuinely changed his perspective." Harrison's tone became more serious. "I'm calling because I want you to know that my family appreciates what you did. And I want to assure you that if Brandon continues to serve, he'll do so on his own merits, not because of any family connections or political influence." After ending the call, Elena sat back in her chair and reflected on the unexpected turn of events. In her experience, parents of problem soldiers usually called to complain about treatment or demand special consideration. She couldn't remember another case where a parent had called specifically to thank her for disciplining their child. The afternoon brought another surprise related to the gate incident. Elena was conducting a meeting with her senior staff when her secretary interrupted to inform her that there was a group of recruits asking to speak with her. This was highly unusual, as recruits in basic training were typically forbidden from leaving their training area without specific authorization. Did they explain what they wanted? Elena asked. The drill sergeant is with them, ma'am. He said it was important and that you would want to hear what they had to say. Curious, Elena agreed to see them. A few minutes later, Drill Sergeant Williams entered her office followed by Brandon Harrison, Chen, and Morrison. All three recruits were in perfectly pressed uniforms and stood at rigid attention. Ma'am, Drill Sergeant Williams said, these recruits requested permission to speak with you. I felt their request was appropriate given the circumstances. Elena gestured for everyone to take seats, though she noticed that the recruits remained standing until specifically ordered to sit. What can I do for you? Elena asked. Brandon Harrison, clearly designated as the spokesman for the group, cleared his throat nervously. Ma'am, we wanted to update you on our progress and to ask for your advice about our future military careers. Elena was intrigued. Go on. Ma'am, the three of us have been talking about what happened at the gate and what we've learned during basic training. We realized that we came into the military with completely wrong expectations and attitudes. We thought our family backgrounds would make us special, but we've learned that what makes soldiers special is their commitment to serving others and to something bigger than themselves. Chen spoke up next. Ma'am, we've been researching different career paths in the Army, and we're particularly interested in opportunities where we can make a real difference. We want to serve in roles where our education and backgrounds can benefit the mission, not where they give us advantages over other soldiers. Morrison, who had been the quietest of the three during the original incident, added, Ma'am, we know we started off badly, but we hope we can prove that we've learned from our mistakes. We want to become the kind of soldiers that reflect well on the Army and on the training we've received here. Elena studied the three young men carefully. The transformation was remarkable, but she wanted to ensure it was genuine rather than simply an elaborate performance designed to impress her. What specifically are you asking from me? She said. Brandon replied, Ma'am, we're asking for your honest assessment of whether you think we have the potential to become good soldiers, and if so, what career paths you think would be most appropriate for us. Elena appreciated the directness of the question, and she decided to be equally direct in her response. 2 weeks ago, I would have predicted that all three of you would wash out of basic training within a month, she said bluntly. You demonstrated arrogance, entitlement, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service requires. She paused to let this assessment sink in before continuing. However, based on the reports I've received from Drill Sergeant Williams and what I've observed today, it appears you've made significant progress in addressing those deficiencies. The question is whether this improvement will be permanent or whether you'll revert to your old attitudes once the pressure of basic training is reduced. 6 months later, Elena Rodriguez stood in the same spot where the confrontation at the gate had occurred, but this time for a very different reason. Fort Marshall was hosting its quarterly award ceremony, and she was there to present commendations to soldiers who had distinguished themselves through exceptional performance and leadership. The autumn morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of weather that made outdoor ceremonies particularly memorable. Hundreds of soldiers and their families had gathered for the event, which recognized everything from individual achievements to unit accomplishments. Elena always enjoyed these ceremonies because they represented the positive side of military leadership, the opportunity to recognize and reward excellence rather than correct deficiencies. As she reviewed her notes for the various presentations she would be making, Elena's attention was drawn to 3 names on the list that brought back immediate memories of that morning 6 months ago. Brandon Harrison, David Chen, and Marcus Morrison were all scheduled to receive awards during the ceremony, and Elena realized she was about to witness the completion of one of the most remarkable transformations she had seen in her military career. The 3 young men had not only successfully completed basic training, but had gone on to excel in their advanced individual training programs. More importantly, they had demonstrated the kind of leadership potential and character development that made them candidates for accelerated promotion and special assignments. As Elena prepared for the ceremony to begin, she reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. The incident at the gate had been a defining moment, not just for the three recruits, but for her own understanding of how effective leadership could create opportunities for growth even in the most unpromising circumstances. The ceremony began with the traditional presentation of colors and the singing of the national anthem. Elena had participated in hundreds of similar events over her career, but she never tired of the sense of pride and unity that these formal military gatherings created. There was something powerful about seeing soldiers from all backgrounds and specialties coming together to honor shared values and common purpose. The first portion of the ceremony focused on unit citations and group achievements. Elena watched as various companies and battalions received recognition for training excellence, operational success, and community service. Each award represented countless hours of dedicated work and sacrifice, and Elena made sure to personally congratulate each recipient as they returned to their seats. When it came time for individual awards, Elena stepped forward to begin the presentations. The first several recognitions were for routine but important achievements: soldiers who had excelled in their military occupational specialties, completed difficult training programs, or demonstrated exceptional dedication to their duties. Then, Elena reached the portion of the ceremony she had been anticipating most. She called for Brandon Harrison to step forward, and watched as the young man approached the podium with confident but humble bearing. The transformation from the arrogant recruit of 6 months ago to the professional soldier standing before her was nothing short of remarkable. Private First Class Brandon Harrison, Elena announced to the assembled crowd, is receiving the Army Achievement Medal for exceptional performance during advanced individual training and for demonstrated leadership in developing innovative solutions to complex logistical challenges. As she pinned the medal on Brandon's uniform, Elena spoke quietly so only he could hear. "Your father would be proud of the soldier you've become." Brandon's response was equally quiet but filled with genuine emotion. "Ma'am, I would never have become this soldier without the lesson you taught me at the gate. Thank you for not giving up on me." Elena stepped back and delivered a crisp salute, which Brandon returned with perfect military precision. As he walked back to his place in formation, Elena could see the pride and satisfaction on his face, but, more importantly, she could see the humility that had replaced his former arrogance. David Chen was called forward next, receiving recognition for his outstanding performance in the military intelligence training program and for his voluntary service mentoring struggling recruits. Elena had learned that Chen had become something of a legend among his peers for his ability to help soldiers who were having difficulty with academic portions of their training. "Your commitment to helping your fellow soldiers succeed exemplifies the best traditions of military service," Elena told him as she presented his award. Chen's response reflected the maturity he had developed over the past 6 months. "Ma'am, I learned from you that military service is about serving others, not ourselves. I'm just trying to live up to that standard." Finally, Marcus Morrison stepped forward to receive his recognition. Elena had been particularly interested to follow Morrison's progress because he had been the most intimidated of the three during their initial encounter. The young man who had been recording the confrontation at the gate, apparently planning to use it for social media attention, was now being recognized for his exceptional performance in the military police training program. Private First Class Morrison, Elena announced, is receiving the Army Achievement Medal for outstanding performance during military police training and for his initiative in developing improved security protocols for base access points. The irony was not lost on Elena that Morrison was being recognized for work related to the very security procedures he had initially tried to circumvent. As she presented his award, she couldn't help but smile at how completely his perspective had changed. "Ma'am," Morrison said as she pinned on his medal, "I want to thank you for showing me what real authority looks like. I thought power came from who you knew or what your family had. You taught me that real authority comes from earning the respect of the people you serve." After all three awards had been presented, Elena remained at the podium to address the assembled crowd. She had decided to use this moment to share some thoughts about leadership, character development, and the transformative power of military service. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, we've just recognized several soldiers who have distinguished themselves through exceptional performance and dedication to duty. But I want to share something with you about the journey these particular soldiers have taken to reach this point." Elena gestured toward Brandon, Chen, and Morrison, who were standing at attention with their newly awarded medals. 6 months ago, these 3 young men arrived at Fort Marshall with attitudes and expectations that were completely inconsistent with military values. They believed that their family backgrounds entitled them to special treatment, and they demonstrated disrespect for the very regulations and procedures we've just honored them for helping to improve. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Many of the soldiers present remembered the incident at the gate, but few had realized the connection to today's award recipients. However, Elena continued, "What happened next illustrates something fundamental about military service and human character. When confronted with their mistakes, these soldiers chose to learn rather than fight. They chose humility over arrogance, service over self-interest, and growth over stagnation." She paused to let her words sink in before delivering her main message. Military service is ultimately about transformation. We take civilians with diverse backgrounds, experiences, and attitudes, and we forge them into soldiers who share common values and purposes. This process doesn't always work, and it's not always easy, but when it does work, the results can be extraordinary. Elena looked directly at the 3 medal recipients. These soldiers are proof that where you come from matters less than where you choose to go. They've demonstrated that character can be developed, that attitudes can be changed, and that anyone who commits themselves to military values can become an exemplary soldier. The ceremony concluded with the traditional retreat ceremony and the lowering of colors. As the crowd began to disperse, Elena was approached by numerous soldiers and family members who wanted to congratulate the award recipients and comment on her remarks about transformation and character development. Among the well-wishers was an older couple who introduced themselves as Brandon Harrison's parents. Elena recognized Congressman Harrison immediately, but she was surprised to see how much more humble and genuine he appeared compared to the demanding politician she had imagined from their phone conversation months earlier. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Congressman Harrison said, extending his hand, "My wife and I wanted to thank you personally for what you've done for our son." Mrs. Harrison, a well-dressed woman with kind eyes, added, "We've watched Brandon grow and mature over these past 6 months in ways we never thought possible. The young man who left for the army is completely different from the son who came home on leave last month." Elena shook hands with both parents. "Sir, ma'am, your son deserves all the credit for his transformation. He chose to embrace military values and work hard to become a better soldier and a better person." Congressman Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps, but we know it could have gone very differently. You had every right to simply punish him for his behavior that morning, but instead you turned it into a learning opportunity. That made all the difference." As the Harrison family moved away to congratulate their son, Elena found herself approached by Chen and Morrison's families as well. Each expressed similar gratitude for the positive changes they had seen in their children, and each credited Elena's leadership with making those changes possible. However, Elena knew that her role had been relatively small in the larger transformation these young soldiers had undergone. The real work had been done by dedicated drill sergeants, training instructors, and the soldiers themselves as they committed to embracing military values and pushing themselves to meet higher standards. Later that evening, as Elena was finishing her administrative duties and preparing to leave the office, she received an unexpected visit from the 3 medal recipients. They had changed out of their dress uniforms and were wearing their standard duty uniforms, but they still carried themselves with the military bearing that had become second nature over the past 6 months. "Ma'am," Brandon said, clearly speaking for the group, "we wanted to update you on our future plans and ask for your advice one more time." Elena gestured for them to sit and gave them her full attention. "We've all been accepted for different programs that will advance our military careers," Chen explained. "Brandon has been selected for officer candidate school, I'm being assigned to a specialized intelligence unit, and Marcus has been chosen for the military police leadership course." Elena was impressed but not entirely surprised by these developments. The 3 had clearly demonstrated the kind of potential that military leadership looked for when making decisions about advanced training and career development. However, Morrison added, we've been talking about ways we might be able to work together in the future to help other soldiers who are struggling with the same kinds of attitude and character issues we had. Brandon nodded enthusiastically. Ma'am, we're thinking about developing a mentorship program for new recruits who come from privileged backgrounds and might need help adjusting to military culture. We want to use our experience to help them avoid the mistakes we made. Elena considered this proposal carefully. Peer mentorship programs could be extremely effective because they allowed struggling soldiers to learn from others who had faced similar challenges. The credibility that came from personal experience often made peer mentors more effective than formal instructors. That's an excellent idea, she said finally. But, remember that effective mentorship requires more than just sharing your own experiences. You'll need to develop real skills in counseling, leadership development, and conflict resolution. Chen smiled. Ma'am, we've actually been researching that. There are several military education programs that focus on leadership development and soldier counseling. We're planning to pursue additional training in those areas as our careers progress. Elena felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she listened to these three young soldiers discuss their plans for continued service and leadership development. The transformation that had begun with a confrontation at the gate had evolved into a genuine commitment to helping others and contributing to the military mission. As the three soldiers prepared to leave, Elena offered them one final piece of advice. Remember that leadership is not a destination, it's a journey. You'll face new challenges and temptations throughout your careers, and you'll need to keep working on your character and values every day. The lesson you learned at the gate was just the beginning, not the end. Brandon stood and came to attention before responding. Ma'am, we understand that completely. We've learned that military service is about continuous improvement, not just meeting minimum standards. We're committed to becoming the kind of leaders who can help others grow and develop, just like you helped us. As Elena watched the three young soldiers leave her office, she reflected on one of the most rewarding leadership experiences of her career. The incident at the gate had begun as a simple disciplinary situation, but it had evolved into something much more significant, a demonstration of how effective leadership could transform not just individual soldiers, but entire perspectives on what military service could accomplish. The next morning, Elena was walking past the main gate on her way to work when she noticed a familiar scene. Another group of new recruits was having difficulty with the security screening process, and their voices were beginning to rise in frustration. However, this time, Elena also noticed three soldiers in advanced training uniforms approaching the situation. She paused to watch as Brandon, Chen, and Morrison quietly intervened, speaking calmly with the frustrated recruits and helping them understand the importance of following security procedures. Their approach was patient, respectful, and effective, drawing on their own experience to help others navigate the same challenges they had once faced. Elena smiled and continued on to her office, confident that the lessons learned at the gate 6 months ago were continuing to create positive impacts throughout Fort Marshall. Sometimes the best leadership development happened not in classrooms or training programs, but in real-world situations where character and values were tested and forged. The transformation of three arrogant recruits into dedicated mentors and leaders represented everything that Elena loved about military service, the opportunity to help people become better versions of themselves while serving something greater than their own interests. It was exactly the kind of success story that made all the challenges of military leadership worthwhile.